Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, where every week we'll have an opportunity to engage people from diverse backgrounds, all in the attempt to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are desirous of the opportunity to engage in deep and meaningful ways, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you with us.
Hello, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins. And it's my privilege today to reflect with you and with my colleagues here on the following question. What does the future hold? Being the church in the COVID aftermath. It's a part of a series we're dealing with on the COVID epidemic, coronavirus, COVID-19. And I've asked several colleagues to join me today. And as we proceed, I'll be introducing them. So I'll introduce them as we go. And we're bringing together a group of thought leaders, Christian leaders, reflecting on this subject from a variety of angles. And so I'm going to start out today with asking Professor John Moorhead, who is at Multi-Faith Matters, the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy, to engage with us on this subject from the vantage point of socio-religious demographic analysis, thinking primarily of the nones and the dones. And John, I'm going to ask you to unpack for us what the nones and the dones are, or who they are, and then how this plays into how the church, how to be the church as we engage, quote unquote, the nones and the dones. So tell us about what the nones and dones are, who they are, and how that even relates to this conversation today, John, as you and I have reflected upon it. And we'll go from there. So John Moorhead, please.
Hey, thank you, Paul, for the opportunity today. Appreciate it. Let me define who those two groups are. The nones, various surveys have been done, one by the Pew Center on Religion and Public Life. And they go out and they ask people, what religion do you self-identify with? And an increasing number of people have selected nuns, not N-U-N-S as in Catholic nuns, but N-O-N-E-S, the nuns. That is, they're not affiliating, self-identifying with any particular religious tradition. A lot of discussion has gone on in the media about how to understand the nuns. I think some of that has been a little misguided. There's been too much emphasis on the increase in the number of atheists and agnostics in that category. While that is certainly there, a lot of the nuns are still interested in spirituality. It's instead for them, they are expressing a dissatisfaction with institutional and traditional forms of spirituality. And the Christian church is a part of that mix. So instead, they're pursuing individualized cafeteria style spirituality. So they may mix a bit of their past Christianity, if they come from a Christian tradition, with some yoga and other forms of spirituality. So the nuns are a part of what we're seeing in our current cultural moment. And then there's another group that doesn't get a whole lot of discussion, particularly in evangelical circles, and that is the dones. That's a very different category. And Josh Packard has done some research. He's a sociologist looking at the dones, and they are a group of committed Christians who many times were in leadership. They were actively involved in their local congregations, and they came to the conclusion that their participation in their churches was actually detrimental to the maintenance of their Christian faith. And so they are done with going to institutional kinds of traditional churches. And they're pursuing various other options, whether that's home churches or perhaps dinner churches are now very popular on these kinds of things. So we have the nuns and the dones, and that is in the broader context of a shift towards post-Christendom spirituality in America. It used to be in the past that the Christian church was something of the defining center of American culture. It was viewed positively. Now we're in post-Christendom. So the church is now, even though evangelicalism still has sufficient numbers, we have seen some decline. Nevertheless, we've seen a loss of credibility, particularly with the close affiliation between white evangelicals and the Trump administration. So that's post-Christendom. We've lost credibility. We are in many ways speaking from the margins. We're not viewed very positively. And that's not post-Christian, that's post-Christendom, which is something very different. So we're in this strange kind of cultural moment. How does all this connect to what we're talking about today with COVID-19? I think that the presence of COVID-19 exacerbates and makes more challenging some of these cultural shifts that we're seeing. So that you've got Christians, and as well as the rest of the population, forced to stay home. We're not able to go to church, which is putting an additional strain on churches that have already been losing members. It increases the fear factor. And because we're increasing the fear factor, we're doubling down on our tribalism. We're embracing things more strongly, such as Christian nationalism. And all of these shifts pose a great challenge to how the Christian church is going to improve its image and engage the culture more positively in the future.
So, John, thank you very much. Again, with the nuns and the duns, and as they perceive how even this morning, New York Times, I think it was an article this morning, reflecting upon the subject of how there are numerous COVID cases arising in the context of church gatherings, as churches have come back and have met or have refused not to meet for a time. There's a sense in which, scientific sense, I believe, that many of these cases are coming from churches gathering together. How does that reflect upon the church in the minds of the nuns and duns? Could you just speak to that a little bit further?
My assumption in that would be that it's an interesting dynamic. In the past, social psychology has indicated that conservatives tend to have a higher fear response and liberals don't. However, with the response to COVID and the mask requirement, that fear dynamic has flipped. So you've got liberals who are more willing to embrace wearing a mask and emphasize safety out of fear for the virus transmission, and conservatives are not. They tend to emphasize the importance of their freedoms, and that includes the freedom to go to church and engage in worship. My assumption would be that the nuns and the duns would look at that and they would interpret the evangelical preference for wearing masks and almost demanding the right to go to church and expose themselves and others to the virus as a confirmation of the fact that the church really is in a difficult kind of place. It prefers to emphasize more its own rights, its own freedoms, rather than humility and service and care for others.
Thank you, John. And I just need to point out, in case the viewers haven't noticed this, but John, your background, besides the books and such, I think viewers are going to be a little interested in what's behind you on the top of that bookcase. I think it's worth noting that John, in addition to being an expert in multi-faith, interreligious dialogue discourse, just had a book come out on orthopathy that's receiving a lot of traction. Is also working in the area of science fiction and fantasy. He has expertise in those domains as well. Social psychology, social sciences and the like, but science fiction. We're going to go from social science and science fiction to science. And here we're going to bring in Professor Josh Swamidass. So John, thank you for that excellent reflection. And I always love looking at whatever you're going to have on behind you on any given interview. So Professor Josh Swamidass, thank you for joining us. And Professor Swamidass of Washington University in St. Louis is the founder of Peaceful Science. I have the privilege of working with him there as an advisor. He works as a scientist, like Professor Moorhead, very much of a polymath, doing all kinds of different explorations. He's a scientist who operates at the intersection of various disciplines with a concern to bring diverse groups and mindsets together. That's a passion of his. It's a real focus at Peaceful Science. His scientific and medical perspective will shine light on how we need to think differently about how churches congregate and also work and engage for the foreseeable future. So Josh, thank you for joining us today at New Wine Tastings.
Thanks for having me.
So Josh, you are a scientist and a Christian. Your work at Peaceful Science is, as I quote, all about making space for difference with the civic practice of science. While people debate the import and the impact of COVID-19, it's hard to imagine things ever going back to the old normal before the virus set in. This includes consideration of the church's own future pertaining to large group gatherings. Given your work in pathology and immunology and concern for human flourishing, how can the church best prepare for the future as it considers how to gather or how it gathers in groups of whatever size for the foreseeable future? Josh, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, that's a great question. And given what I'm about to say next, it's important to date my comments. This is July 2020. And the reason why that's important is that from a scientific point of view, from a medical point of view, I'm at Washington University, one of the leading medical hospitals or teaching hospitals in the country. We just actually don't know what the future holds. It's changing a great deal, even from week to week at times, and certainly from month to month. I've really never seen anything like that. And I've talked to my colleagues that have been in the field for a very long time. You know, they haven't either. So we don't really know what the future holds. And so that's a very uncomfortable place for institutions that tend to transcend these sorts of things, where we want stability when we're, you know, making a building purchase or setting policy for the long term. And we don't have that right now. And so I think one of the things that this is going to be calling out from the church is a wisdom that's rooted in patience, where we should be able to calm down, realize that this is a very difficult situation, that it's going to be costly, and there's going to be a real need to have empathy and care for the people that are the most hurt by it. And then also to have the wisdom to just realize that maybe even though it hurts us a great deal, there's actually people around us that are even more hurt by it than us. And to find that place of peace in the middle of some of the most chaotic times any of us have ever or will ever see. I think that's I think the situation. So what makes me concerned as a scientist? Well, there's recent data that's come out that showed that for example, in Spain and Italy, only about 5% of the population was infected over the last year. What that means is that, you know, if you think about 5% and all the damage that caused, all the death, the loss of property, loss of wealth, loss of life, you could multiply that times 20, and not what could be what's ahead of us if we're not careful. That is dramatic. Now you go to the United States, it's much less than that. I mean, it's the type of thing where it could be 100 times worse if we're not cautious. That's terrifying. Is the reason to have hope? Well, there is, because, you know, we have found that our actions collectively as society can impact things. And one of the most shocking things of all, to be honest, was statements from the NIH now coming out that there might actually be a vaccine by the end of the year. I don't know how to explain to you how unprecedented it would be and how shocking and how unexpected it would be if there was an effective vaccine available in less than a year. Nothing like this has happened in the history of the human race, if it happens, which could substantially really reduce the impact altogether, though we still have to wait till December. And so there's a great deal of uncertainty. Now think about those from all the different points of angles of view that you can think about. You know, if we can't be patient till January, when a vaccine is available in the best case scenario, if we can't be patient about that, there could be a large amount of unnecessarily loss of life. And that's I think the types of questions that we really have to seriously think about and consider. So what else does this really call out, I think, for the church? I think this is an opportunity for us to think through what it means to really serve a city. Instead of thinking about how to conduct a service or to serve a congregation, how do we really step up as citizens of a city, so we can be concerned not just about our rights, but also the rights of others, and not just the concerns that are going to affect us, but what's going on around us. I think those are the key things that this is calling out, and why it's so difficult, because it's not something any of us would do naturally, and it's something that we struggle with in the American church, to be honest. You know, as bad as it's hitting us in the United States, we should have honestly far more concern for what's happening in Africa and India and all these other places. And maybe we might even get some more hope from there too. I think one of the things that's encouraged me the most as I look at our post-Christendom context in the United States, as we are in many ways moving into exile as a church in exile, is that, you know, when you look at the church in India, when you look at the church in China, where they don't have power, where they're truly persecuted in a way that we can only analogize to our context, you can ask, you know, what happens when the church is in that situation? Does it just dissolve and fall apart? Well, actually, no, the church thrives. And in fact, they might avoid many of the vices we have. And I think that that's the hopeful thing ahead as we think about what it means to live in a world, in a country where we don't control everything, and where we maybe, you know, maybe have to learn to be okay with that and realize that Christ laid down power. Maybe we don't need it either.
Thank you, Josh. A lot of overlap and synthetic engagement already involving what you and John have said. And John talked about how, you know, we're moving more and more toward the margins as a church in our society. Instead of having to have power, seize power, control, how do we learn to live in that context of sharing life, sharing space? And we're going to be going to Carrie here in a few minutes to discuss further that in her work, and CJ and then Brad. But, you know, you had mentioned as well, Josh, some real key virtues, some would call it, or values, dispositions, whatever you want to call it. But, you know, the idea of patience. The church needs to be patient. We need to have empathy toward others, not simply look out for our own concerns, but also for those of others, especially those who are suffering far more than we might in our context, and to learn from the church, going outward, learning from the church abroad, their resilience, India, Africa, and elsewhere, and to see our need for them and to care for them, as well as you were saying. And so one thing, if we don't have time this episode, Josh, but maybe at another point, you and perhaps another scientist or two to discuss how people look at the change, like don't wear a face mask, wear a face mask. You know, they've heard different reports. People think that science can be just fake news, not understanding how science is constantly analyzing data, peer review, trying to come up, and it's moving. The virus is shifting, so science has to shift. Maybe we'll have opportunity later this episode or at a future point, Josh, to come back to that, because I think that's critically important, especially amongst evangelicals, where there's often a suspicion of certain forms of science, especially if it doesn't fit our own ideological cultural bent. So thank you so much for those great reflections. As we think about what it means for the church to be missional, when we think about the nuns and the duns, Carrie, when we think about not having power at center stage, losing that limelight, so to speak, that John and Josh were talking about. You at Church Lab in Austin, Texas, you know, you've been doing work in this sphere for some time now. Ever since your work with Richard Mowat Fuller, you've explored novel forms of religious gatherings and interaction of diverse participants. Carrie, we've worked together with Multi-Faith Matters. As I said, you work with Church Lab, you lead that work in Austin, Texas. You work with mainline Protestants, evangelicals. I mean, you work with, I think, Catholics. You work across the spectrum, right? You work with people from other faith traditions. You even work with me. Carrie, how has COVID-19 shaped your research at Church Lab in Austin, Texas? And what might you be developing to assist pastors and diverse context in fostering communion and mission for the future? And then lastly, what are your hopes and fears, and how might the church learn from this present moment to turn obstacles into future opportunities for thriving ministry? Carrie Graham.
Thank you, Paul. It's so fun to be here. Wow, there's so much to say about this. I realize we're on limited time, so I'll be very careful. In terms of my own hopes, I resonate with what's already been said regarding the opportunity to think beyond ourselves. Being concerned with the survival of our church buildings, or even in some cases specific church communities, I'm not sure is so relevant to our moment. I think thinking of Christendom, thinking of what it means to follow Jesus and to disciple and be disciplers, in this moment naturally moves us beyond thinking of just ourselves. So many of my hopes are in what I think is sort of a phoenix moment for the church, capital C, and what it means for in some cases, communities who will, in bold faith, close for the sake of something greater. And in other cases, new expressions as we seek to meet rising needs in our communities, that will see new expressions arise from those ashes, from that fertile ground. I also think that humans, we don't often choose change, right? And COVID has brought in change that's not asking for our permission, and an acceleration of change in the religious landscape. We have an opportunity to respond with some bold faith, right? So a few comments about what Church Lab is doing. We're in no shortage of work right now, right? One process that I've been using with churches and pastors is something that we're calling the Pantry. The Pantry harkens to that moment when shelter in place began for each of us, and maybe we couldn't access our ingredients that we wanted for our favorite meals, right? So what did we do? We go to the pantry, we take stock of what we have, and we scramble some things up to make some new recipes that meet the rising need of the moment, right? And so to that end, I've been working with some congregations who are going to their own pantry, so to speak, and saying, what are our ministry strengths? What have they been, whether they lie dormant right now or not? And how do we take inventory of that and then look at what rising needs are in our communities and cross-section that, get creative about what new recipes may arise from that. So one important thing that takes, it's certainly to piggyback off of the patience comment, very fitting, is a real enthusiasm for pneumatology right now, right? So a heavy leaning on the Holy Spirit. I don't know about y'all, but there are days where the pastors I work with and we don't even know what we need, much less our congregants. So to loosen the reins on our sense of control and to lean into the Holy Spirit's guidance from moment to moment and day by day, I think is a very central spiritual discipline for us right now. And so as part of that, coming up with new recipes and being in tune with God's guidance, I think elicits a couple of helpful ways to meet the moment. One is a Band-Aid, and one is a little bit more long-term and transformative. The Band-Aids that many of our churches are engaging right now are vital, they're important, but they're not forever. What do I mean by that? Facebook Live worship, Zoom room, Bible studies, all that jazz. It's really good for the moment, right? It's good immediately. It's probably not an expression of what's emerging to come and to stay. It's kind of a less good version of what's really familiar to us, right? We're going to do worship. We're going to do it sort of the closest we can get in a Zoom room or on Facebook. That's good. That's good for the moment. It may not be forever. So then what otherwise the pantry kind of tends to in finding new recipes, so to speak, is when we start to listen to God's guidance and start to take stock of what tools we have as a church family, to mix my metaphors, what ingredients we have as a church family and how we might be able to serve, then there's some fertile ground. There's some creative territory there to say, what haven't we thought of yet that might be present for us to engage? And I guess a couple comments about the pastors that I'm caring for these days and what I'm encouraging and seeing in them. If it's not obvious already, this truly is a time for bold faith and not for insular thinking. So what do we as religious leaders need to do to set ourselves up for wisdom and discernment and spiritual groundedness as followers of Jesus? We need to we need to stay connected and be vulnerable with our loved ones, with other pastors with whom we can be vulnerable as we process our own grief. We need to, and I'm sorry to sound inappropriate here, but we need to make like poop and fart jokes. And what I mean by that is we need to, previously, we might have moments where we need to say to each other, okay, everybody, let's tamp down and get serious and talk about something substantive. But right now in pandemic times, the air that we breathe is serious and heavy all the time. And our brains and our bodies are weary. And so to survive this marathon of serving community needs and church family needs, we need to play. We need to giggle, frankly. We need to have moments to exhale and recuperate. And also, I would say, among many things, helping us to stay grounded enough to take big risks and to not operate out of the fear and anxiety that would make us so insular would be financial floofiness, right? So that job security has never been a great reason to go into ministry, and it's less so today, and it's going to be way less so going into the future, I'd imagine. So as much as we can do at home personally to create a stable financial situation for ourselves, as pragmatic as this is, it's very powerful to realize that we don't have handcuffs when we need to make bold faith decisions, but may otherwise be worried about paying our mortgage or our electricity bills. So what does it mean to, in pragmatic and spiritual ways, to set ourselves up as leaders, to be in tune with the Spirit, and then to go wherever that may be leading us? I think that's where some of the transformative work lies for us right now.
Thank you, Pastor Graham. And I think further to what Professor Swamidass was saying about how to have an impact as we think beyond our doors, thinking how do we serve the community as a whole? How are we a church for the city? I hear, connections with what you're saying, Pastor Carrie, and, just being able to participate in a venture with Professor John here, with you and others in Austin, just how you're bringing diverse people together to think through things entrepreneurially, creatively, boldly. You said in the spirit, pneumatologically, pragmatically. There's a lot there. Is there a website that people can go to if they want to find out more about your work at Church Lab?
Yes, always happy to make a plug. Thank you, Paul, for handing that to me. Thechurchlab.org is our website. Like the article, Church Lab, as in laboratory.org, thechurchlab.org. Yeah.
Great, and since we're on those plugs, Josh, Peaceful Science, what is the website? It's still on mute. Okay.
Yeah, so Peaceful Science at peacefulscience.org.
Peacefulscience.org.
There you go.
Thank you. And John, give us one of your websites.
For my work in multi-faith engagement, in collaboration with good folks like you and Carrie, multifaithmatters.org.
Multifaithmatters.org. Yeah, just a lot of great insights coming from the three of you, and just really grateful for that. And as we transition to my partner in crime, CJ Young, who has one of the most robust beards in the midst of the COVID nightmare, it really helps. He wears it as a facial mask, and he's our chair of the New Wine Advisory Council. He's the chair of our New Wine Advisory Council, and he as well as Dr. Harper, keep me in line most of the time. And Pastor Young, you're a pastor up in Port Orchard, Washington. You are working with a diverse community, people with different perspectives on how the church should meet. What should we do? And, in preparation for this, I was thinking about what a pastor friend of ours said in Reno, Nevada. He said, if Disney is open, all is right with the world, is how many Christians tend to think of America and the like. Well, Disney has not been open, and it delayed reopening as far as I understand. I think they're still trying to figure this out like the rest of us. So is all well with the world if Disney stands for America and even for the church? Visitors hope to gain the same Disney when they go back. They want to gain that same Disney experience. It's a small world after all, so on and so forth. How do you have that with 6 feet spacing and wearing face masks and such? It's no longer such a small world, it seems, with social distancing. But perhaps something is similar in terms of church. And CJ, you and I have talked about this. Others and I have talked about this, how, you know, people have expectations, right? When they go back to church, they want it to be the same as it's always been. Well, what happens? Even after the vaccine, what happens if we can't have the same experience? You know, whatever happens to the mega church, mini church, somewhere in between church, we can still have a mega impact. We can still have an experience in the spirit, like Carrie was talking about. CJ, what are your thoughts about how to help people with their expectations going forward with this? How do you foresee helping parishioners manage their varying expectations, perhaps in light of different perspectives even on COVID-19 or the coronavirus, even while hoping to lead the entire community together into a vibrant Christian experience for years to come? CJ.
I would say this is interesting. I work at like I said, I work in a church in Port Orchard. We're across the water is what we say from Seattle. So we're kind of a suburb bedroom community. A lot of veterans. We're an intergenerational church. It's about a middle-aged church, probably 44 years or so old. It's pretty diverse in ages and participation and families that come. We have a lot of teachers and educators, a lot of blue-collar workers, and that kind of makes up our meet. We have conservatives and liberals, depending where people lie and how they've gotten here. We have a military base nearby, and so people get trucked in all the time on a boat, and then they leave, you know, after 3 or 4 years, so you're deployed somewhere else. So it's just a really diverse community. And when this all hit, one of the big struggles we had initially was, I didn't expect it as well, was the staff at large, our staff at large. Before we could even talk about trying to reopen and recreate or what the church could be in this crisis, there was a lot of dealing with our own emotional, like where we were at. Some of us were reacting instead of responding to this virus. There's still people on staff at our church that are very just having a difficult time, and all they want is to go back to what was. And it's not because they lack theological understanding. It's I don't want to critique them at all. It has to do with, that's what their heart was. It was a worshipful experience, a connection to God, something they long for. Some of them are very lonely, and that's their connection. And that was something that met those needs in their lives, and now they're completely gone without them. They spend every day, you know, on their own. It's heartbreaking. But the reality of dealing with their own emotions through all of this, the reluctance to even desire to change. I think our church has been one of the more innovative churches in our area. We didn't miss a beat. We kind of jumped right to online format, even though we hadn't done that before. And I was really surprised by a church that's, you know, we always say we're a contemporary church, but I mean, we're contemporary for like 2003 or something, but we're working on it, you know. We're just intergenerational, so our sweet spot's about halfway in there. But the idea of pivoting and being innovative and changing and shifting, it's cool because we got right back down to our roots. One of the first things we did as a congregation was, or as a leadership team, is we had a service we had to do, and the typical thing that we could do. But we also said we're going to prioritize people individually. And so we were on the phone constantly and just contacting every single person. There's, you know, 600 people that call our church home, 650 people or something, and our staff was on the phone. And we actually had more people calling, and we called every week, and we called multiple times a week. We checked in with the high risk people and what they needed, and we became this hub for that, and creating space for people to help one another, and being able to, you know, lots of people wanted to help, a lot of people needed help, and trying to build connection points for that. And so we had to shift and pivot as a church. But if I'm honest, there's a lot of reluctance. There's still a big desire, honestly. It's months later, and there's still a big desire to go back. And so even asking the question, what is this going to look like in the fall, has been, I mean, I had a staff meeting yesterday, and it's a question we're trying to avoid. There's some people on staff that are very, very concerned with, I don't want it to look different. I loved what was, and it's hard. I think we're still in that mourning process, trying to decide, are we ready to move on to what could be? And are we willing to bury that? And that's hard. And again, pastorally, and just if you have a heart for people at all, recognizing that in your leaders and in your congregation is a really hard thing. my work with New Wine, this idea of coming to the table and meeting people where they're at and living through our theological convictions, that is tough to do in this time. Just recognizing that every person I call, every person I interact with, every meeting I have with every different staff member is a person that has that comes to the table with feelings, and they're honestly, every one of them is in crisis. So I love Carrie's idea that we need some levity in this time. We had a meeting last night, and we all met in this big field. We were all socially distanced and masked up, and it clearly did not feel like your typical, session meeting or what have you. But the silliness of the group was it was laughable. It was people needed to joke. They needed to be around people even at 6 feet away. Some of those people, this is the first time they've been out of their house in over a month, and it's just to be around people, and to be able to interact and to laugh and to just see the kind eyes of your brothers and sisters in Christ. It's been a lot of them are teched out. At first, they were excited about the Zooms that we're doing and the lives that we're doing and all the technology stuff we're doing, but they're like, they've reached their threshold and they're done. So it's caused us to kind of look at things like that. We've had to look at our consumerism as a church. That's been a real hard pill to swallow a bit. Honestly, I feel like this is confession. Sorry, we're just like our church. I'm speaking for our church only. Like the consumerism aspect, like how much we were doing week in and week out, and it may not align with what we were hoping to do or what we felt called to or led by the Spirit to do overall, and how much of our time was taking that up. And that has been leading us to questions like, why do we exist and what is the church? And but then we have and staff were having those conversations. How do we have those conversations at large with our congregation? Because that's something I think that the congregation needs to be included in as well, as these conversations. What is the church? Why does the church exist? How does it exist? The format of an online viewable sermon series, maybe, but that's still, this is more of a dialogue than it is a monologue. And so this would be great to have these conversations, but how do you do that? So not even if you're a church ready to pivot, ready to shift, ready to look to how to serve the city and to move out and into the community more than you have been in the past, how do you engage the culture or engage the congregation, the people involved, and get on the same page, cast vision? Like all of this stuff has to be rethought out. And I mean, I'm speaking to the complexities of it, but personally, I'm an innovator. Like I love this. Like this is, I always joke about, and I don't think it's very funny anymore, is that I'm an introvert who doesn't like touching people. So this is my jam. I was created for this. But yeah, it's not funny anymore. It was funny a long time ago. But the idea that how do we change? How do we shift? I get excited about that and what the church could be. I love getting down to our roots and what we're most passionate about. I'm very excited about my local congregation. When the church had to close its doors and we could not let people in, it got down to the people. Like the people mattered, and are we loving them well? And I thought I was really impressed by that being it's like it reveals your core beliefs, your core your core central ideas and ethics in your church. And just to touch on, you asked about the reopening thing. I don't feel like I've adequately answered that yet, but we just, in our state, again, I feel like I need to date it because it's, like Josh said, it's changing all the time. And in July of 2020, this is we just reopened a few weeks ago. As a church, we can have 50 people in our church, socially distanced. And if you come in the church building, we had to film videos of what it would look like and try to mediate like what people's expectations were. I get phone calls every week about, are things changing? Are we still requiring masks? Where do we stand as a church as far as this belief system? And I get them I feel like every day I get a call on either side of the mask argument or either side of the reopening argument or either side of the science argument. And lovingly, we need to meet people where they're at, be as safe as humanly possible, but also try to meet the people where they are at, who, again, are denying science or what have you, and meet them where they're at as best we can while still keeping everybody safe. It's a very hard road to navigate, and it feels like we're always wrong. So like no matter what we do, we're wrong. But I'll say a lot of the feedback we got, we reopened. This is more like I said, a testimony, and we had a large number of people that first week. We had to register. It was we had to be very careful. We split our congregation up into different rooms and had multiple services and stuff. And what we're finding now is people came and it wasn't the experience they expected. And so on a sour note, a lot of people are choosing not to come back, and that's hard and heartbreaking. I mean, it seems like they're tuning in online. We don't know. But then on a positive note, though, we are seeing people say, well, that wasn't what I expected. So they're creating like their own worshiping venues in their own homes. And so it's like we've planted dozens of churches all over Kitsap County. So that's been kind of an exciting thing, scary and exciting because there's less, we didn't plan for this. It's not an innovation that we've created. It's the one that was created by necessity. And so it's exciting. I get excited about it. But again, when Carrie was asking about the future, we don't know what the future church looks like. And we're not allowed to use the term new normal. That scares people too much, but we could say, what is it going to look like long term? And honestly, like I said, I don't feel like it's healthy, but in lots of ways we're avoiding those questions and saying, hopefully it'll be back to normal by fall. Even though in the back of our heads, I think we all know it's not. And we have a guy who works for 3M, who's an immunologist in our church, who said, buckle your seatbelt, this is going to be a few years at least, even with the vaccine and stuff. And so it's time to start thinking longer term. And I hope people are starting to listen, and I think we are. It's just dealing with our own emotions, our own feelings, our own reactions to all of this. And not just the virus and the science and all these other things that we might debate on or these political arguments that we make. It's just the emotional aspect. Like, the reality is we had one staff meeting who said, just share where you're at. And people were angry, and people were lonely, and people were tired, and people were frustrated. And like that, just owning where you're at and starting from there, and then learning how to care for one another so that we can respond instead of react.
Thank you so much, CJ. A lot of powerful themes that resonate with others, what they've shared so far in this interview. When I think about the emphasis on empathy that Josh was talking about, you're talking about the need to listen to one another, to really process what one another is saying, to feel what one another is saying. I hear that coming across clear, that resilience, that courage, that boldness, what Carrie was talking about, the creativity Carrie was talking about. I see that at work as well in what you're saying, CJ. That matter of space at the table, we're going to turn to Brad here in just a minute. You're dealing with the diversity of people, diversity of expectations, and trying to meet each one, so to speak, at a table, whether it's in person 6 feet away or virtually over Zoom. You're trying to engage it, but resilience is a key theme. And as we think about the nuns and duns, what John was talking about earlier, maybe we're not going to be able to have the same experience, but maybe as a church, it's going to help us to be more that church for the nuns and the duns, to push ourselves out of our typical modes of engagement. That's my hope and desire. And I love the kind of creativity, the sense of like, let's not give up. Let's learn from the church abroad. I mean, they're so often far more resilient than we are, further to what Josh was saying. And we have so much to learn from the global church. As we turn to Dr. Harper, thanks so much, Pastor Young. Dr. Harper is the Associate Director of New Wine, New Wineskins, and he is also Professor of Theology at Multnomah University and Seminary. Pastor for 13 years before coming to Multnomah to teach. Back around the same time, we came together around the same time, back in around 1999, 2000. He regrets that day. But Brad, you were a pastor in St. Louis, where Josh is, and for, again, 13 years. As you think about this, I'm sure it was music to your ears, Brad, what CJ was talking about, the theological questions that he's involved in engaging as a pastor with his congregants about what is the church? What is the church, and how is the church to be engaged? Since our book project, Brad, Exploring Ecclesiology, that we wrote together several years ago, you and I have discussed at length multi-site church campuses. You've helped my own understanding on that, and how there are strengths and weaknesses to such church assemblies. You've been a part of one, if I'm not mistaken, a very large church with multi-site campuses. You're an elder at a church in Vancouver, Washington now. As an evangelical and ecumenical theologian who cherishes the Catholic emphasis on the biblical notion of the body of Christ, what are the prospects and perils of social media in your estimation for assembly as the church, Dr. Harper? And then also, as a church leader, as a pastor and elder for many years, how would you encourage church leaders to navigate this terrain presently and establishing practices for the future? Brad.
Well, thank you, Paul. I just want to say, first of all, you didn't ask me about my website. You guys can go to it. It's called don'tlistentopaulmetzger.com. It has a very, very large following. And I really appreciate Carrie's idea about humor. We need humor. In fact, we need COVID humor. One of our favorite jokes at Multnomah now begins, how many COVID survivors does it take to put a mask on Paul Metzger because he can't put one on himself? So these are things that
It's about time to end this episode.
You know, one of the things that I've just been watching here, it's been interesting to me is, you know, Paul, we started to do different kinds of education years ago at Multnomah. We started, first of all, with degree completion programs, and now a lot of online stuff. And I just, I remember so often the innovators of education telling us that, you know, not only is online education just as good as in-class education, but in fact, it's really better, which you and I never really bought. But it's interesting, now we got all these millennials and Gen Zs that are suing universities to get their tuition back because they're like, online education isn't what I signed up for and it's not as good. So, I mean, in some senses, as much as I love what we do with technology, I think there's a chastening of technology going on, Zoom fatigue, right? Something people are talking about. I mean, it's a wonderful thing, but it's also a problematic thing. And when I think about that theologically, I think about, in my own background in Catholic theology, the Catholic emphasis on incarnation, the Catholic emphasis on physicality, the idea even of the church as a sacrament itself, as something that physically, locationally presents Christ to the world. And there's a lot of things I just love about that. There's something about physical presence in worship that is so powerful. In the theology of the Apostle Paul, we get this idea that spiritual gifts are things that are embodied. When you read Paul's theology of the gifts, so often in American evangelical thinking, we've talked about gifts as skills, which end up really just commodifying people. But in fact, Paul never talks about it that way. The gifts are not the skills, the gifts are the persons. Christ and his grace are incarnated in human beings, and thus through the physicality of their existence, they bring Christ to one another in the body. And that's something that cannot be fully replaced by Zoom. And I think we're realizing that. I think there are a lot of young people who love technology, the young people I'm listening to who are also going, wow, it's not everything it's cracked up to be. We're hearing our students at Multnomah saying, we want to come back to campus. We don't want to do this online thing. We want to be with each other. I sense this in my own church. There's this clear desire to be back together physically, as all of you have talked about in terms of CJ talking about people wanting to be back. We just had last week a beloved elderly man in the congregation who died, not of COVID, but of other things. And there's this anxiety in the community that we can't go be with his wife in this time of loss. And so I think one of the things that's happening is COVID is actually waking us up to the limitations of technology. There's some things that technology simply cannot do in the same way that life on life, face on face, physical presence can do in terms of worship, ministry, and life of the church. And so I think there's going to continue to be a longing for that. On the other hand, of course, there's also amazing benefits of social media. I mean, where would we be as the church if we didn't have it right now? If we weren't able to do Zoom church, if we hadn't been able to do these kinds of things. Virtual community is still community, even if it is of a lesser kind. It is still community. It is still real. It's a tool to facilitate authentic, if diminished, community in a time like this. And so taking advantage of it, I think, is an important thing. Evangelicals in America have always been innovators with media and all kinds of different ways of engaging the contemporary venues for communication and expressing the life of Christ through this. And so I think it's something evangelicals are used to in America. I think it's helpful. And it's helpful because social media is the language of this generation. It is the language of millennials. It's the language of Gen Zs. And so we must use it. It's like a translation issue from language to language. But then again, we also have to be aware of the baggage that it brings and its limitations. I remember being part of a large church here in Vancouver that went multi-site about a decade ago. I went to one of the smaller satellite churches for some years, and I remember after being in that church a few months, I wasn't able to attend the Sunday meeting at that church, so I went to the main mother church on a Saturday night, and after the church service, I went up to the senior pastor and I hugged him, and I said, I need to do this to you, because when I go up and hug the screen at the satellite church, it's just not the same reality. And so, you know, there's drawbacks to that, and we just have to realize that and think about, you know, how do we engage these things. Then I would say also, in terms of kind of pastoral advice, this is a time to really focus on people in need, to focus on the vulnerable. We need to think about emphasizing community that is fostered by helping members who are stressed by COVID. I'm sure you've all seen this. We have many members in our church who are stressed by COVID in a variety of different ways because of their physical health, some who've lost jobs. And so this is one of those moments that creates an opportunity for us to think about who are the vulnerable, who are those in need, which is something I think as American evangelicals, we have kind of a triumphalist view of ourselves. We tend to not do that enough. I feel like this idea that I hear a lot from American evangelicals to demand the right to gather in space at church as kind of this right to religious freedom. In my view, that's a very American thing. And it's a thing that in some ways comes out of a 20th century development where American evangelicals, after being the leaders of society for so long, felt themselves begin to be marginalized after the Scopes trial. And ever since, we've been fighting back and trying to figure out how to take America back for Jesus. And it's a failed proposition. It's an unbiblical proposition in my mind. It's a very American thing. And in fact, what we do when we say we have the right, you know, to visit, to worship in space, what we end up doing is we actually ignore the vulnerable. Because what happens is as that New York Times article indicated, when we come back together and we visit in space, we end up actually hurting those who are most vulnerable and most marginalized. In terms of social media, again, I think there's great things about it. I'm glad we have it. We need to use the media to create the most reality, the most presence that we possibly can. I'm watching my pastoral staff at my church do some amazing things that are making the worship service, the gathering, feel as now as real as possible. Real people leading us in worship. Even though we have two services, so even though the worship music time and the pastoral teaching and the sacrament are pre-recorded, one of the things they've done is to put a live chat on the side so that as the worship is going on, as the teaching is going on, people can interact with each other and tell each other, hey, we're here, we miss you. And so there's some really creative things we can do with social media that aren't the same as presence, but they do the best that we can. I think we need to recognize the isolation and loneliness that can be created by the digital world. I am convinced, and have been for a long time, we need to move away from the seeker service concept of letting people be anonymous, which is so popular at the end of the 20th century. This is a time when we need to communicate that the church is not a place to be anonymous. It's a place to be seen. It's a place to be heard. It's a place to be cared for. It's a place where people, we want to draw people into community. As such, I think we need to work at creating meaningful interaction, communal interaction around the sacraments. You know, American evangelicalism has a history, for example, in the sacraments of passing Jesus through the rows, and moving to an idea where the sacraments are more about actually getting up out of our seats, engaging one another, moving towards one another, seeing the horizontal aspect of the sacraments. Perhaps, I wonder if in the future there's going to be more sense of, I want to engage the pastor when he's teaching, asking questions, you know, so which would be interesting, and of course could never happen in a megachurch. And I wonder if COVID is indeed another step in perhaps what might be the demise of the megachurch, in that millennials and Gen Zs don't love it anyway. I think this is a time for pastors to be teaching their congregation and speaking to the circumstances, to what's going on. And we need to be careful, because what American evangelicals tend to do is then politicize it, talk about the political issues. Which is not what I'm talking about. What I think we need to be doing is talking about what kinds of personal, communal, theological questions is this situation creating, and how do we address that in the light of the triune incarnate God to bring answers to each other and to our community. You know, it's interesting that in the Middle Ages, when the plague hit, one of the things that happened is people became very introspective and began asking the question, is there really a meaning to life in the midst of the fact that everybody around me is dying? And I think pastors have an opportunity to capitalize that and say, what does it look like for there to be true eternal meaning in life now, in the midst of the brokenness and death and separation that this is creating for us? What does that look like?
Thank you so much, Brad. A lot to reflect on theologically, ecclesially, that is for the church, and then just culturally as a whole. And, you know, the politics of Jesus's kingdom always intersects and moves through and beyond the different political divisions that we have in our society, as he engages the orphan, the widow, the alien in their distress through the Spirit. And you see this in the book of Acts, just that resilience, what we've been talking about, the long patience, the long suffering, the empathy, the local, the global church. So many themes here, the need for a holy boldness, the entrepreneurship. And I think you, as my colleagues, have given us a lot to think about. I know one of you has to leave the call in just a minute or two. So I'll start with Carrie, but I just would ask for like 1 minute follow-up from each. And if you have to go two, that's fine. But just based on what you've heard, any closing thoughts? We'll start with Carrie, go to Josh, John, CJ, and Brad. How's that? Carrie, and you're on mute. Pastor Graham.
Hello, Lightning Round. You know, I'm not sure that I have much to add. I've really enjoyed the very fun Venn diagram nature of what each of us have shared. There's a lot of overlap, but there's a lot of, I think, helpful contrast from each of our entry points into this issue. So I'd really just like to express appreciation for this conversation. It's been a help to me, and I think it will be to others too. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Pastor Graham. Dr. Swamidass?
So I think that it's easy to see all the unsettledness and be uncomfortable. It's helpful to also see it from the other point of view. Honestly, I'm very hopeful. The world as we had it before wasn't really perfect either. When things get unsettled this way, there is grief about losing things, but also there's an opportunity to get something better. I think this is one of those moments that we as a society get to pause and really try and find a better way together. And I think that there is a possibility, there's a hope that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, that we might look back on this summer of discontent, the summer with the death of George Floyd, with a dog walker who literally, threatened a black man with police violence, thinking she could do this with impunity. We'll look back on all of these things and maybe wonder if this is what gave us an opportunity to reform and to find that better way.
Thank you so much, Josh. Dr. Swamidass, thank you. Professor Moorhead?
Yeah, I've appreciated this conversation and listening to my colleagues as well. I think that what I would add in summary is just the church has always, through her history, responded to a changing culture, different expressions of the gospel and what the church might look like. Recently, I just finished reading a book and having an interview with Alan Street, who reassessed the Lord's Supper. And I found that you can connect dots to not only what the global church is doing, what might we learn there, but also the ancient church. Street makes the argument that the Lord's Supper was not historically in the first century just bread and wine. It was a meal. It followed a Roman pattern. And the church met together in a meal, expressing hospitality, anti-imperial. And I think just reflecting on our early church history and the forms in which the church met, we can experiment with those things today. And especially with the rise of Christian nationalism and evangelical alignment with Trump, what does it mean to be anti-imperial as a church in the 21st century in America?
Thank you, John. Professor Moorhead, thank you very much. Pastor Young.
I want to express as well that as much as I wanted to address all the complexities of this and how difficult it's been. And I'm actually not at all worried about where this is going to end up in a lot of ways. I'm excited about what the future may hold and what God might be doing to shake up the church, both our individual church and the church at large. I feel like in so many ways, our individual church has talked a lot about authenticity and the desire for an increased amount of that. And what an opportunity to be able to do that and share exactly where we're at. I've been sharing with the congregation that it's hard for me not to always be wrong. Like no matter which phone call I'm getting, like we're not doing enough to open up, we're doing too much. And it's like, it's wearing. And for us to be able to share that authenticity and to be real with one another and to share struggles that we're having, that everyone's having, it's creating an environment and a culture that I hope see significant change. I do hope that's like Josh talked about, that in a couple of years we can look back at this time as a time to be reflective as the church about what we're about, what we're called to be, and how we sought to be authentic in our pursuit of Jesus Christ together in this time. And like I said, I just could look forward not only to being there 2 years or 3 years or 7 years from now, but in the next year to see what might come and the shifts and the pivoting and the innovation that the church does to be the church in this time. So I'm excited. I'm excited for continued conversations like this, and I hope that New Wine and Multnomah continues to do things like this, because I think people are looking for it, and it's a life-giving space, I think, and I'm encouraged by it. So thank you for everybody's input. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I hope for our viewers that you're finding this interface between, pastoral missional work and scientific inquiry, natural science, social science, and the like, theology, this intersection as meaningful to all of you. You sense mindfulness, hopefulness, honesty, and the like. Dr. Harper, your thoughts.
So many great things going on here. I really appreciate it. I really appreciated what John said about times like this exacerbating culture shifts and moving us to new places of reevaluation. And I really hope that goes on for us, for the nuns and duns. It's my view that much of what creates some of the discontent with the church in younger generations is because so often the American evangelical church is more American than it is focused on the kingdom of God. I would love to see our values really begin to be reevaluated and shift more to focus on the kingdom of God and its values rather than on American values. And in the midst of that, I think it's fascinating that this very, very strong sense of race issues has arisen and is being talked about now. And from the time that I was a little boy, we always sang in the American evangelical white church, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. but we've never really taken that seriously. And this may be a cultural time where we actually do that. And if we do it, it could be incredibly transformative to the church for the kingdom of God.
So will we be mindful? Will we be hopeful? Will we be depending on the Spirit of God? Will we be living into the reality of Jesus Christ, the incarnate one, as he moves through the church, not simply as an American church or an Indian church or as an African church, but the church through all these different cultural expressions here and abroad, as we work with the global church and work with one another, as we grieve with one another, as we rejoice with one another, as we proceed together. I've been so encouraged by this opportunity to engage with all of you, pastors and professors. Thank you for your time, Pastor Graham, Pastor Young, Professor Swamidass, Professor Moorhead, and Professor Harper. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us at New Wine Tastings, where we deal with the subject, what does the future hold? Being the church in the COVID aftermath. God bless you all. I look forward to the next opportunity to engage with each of you, my colleagues, and all of you who join us today through this episode. Blessings to everyone.